psychology and sociology with a concentration in gender studies. And he's been involved with camps and youth development for over 20 years as a camper, counselor, administrator, teacher, and consultant. He's also the director of Dragonfly Forest, which is a kids camp specifically for children with serious illness and disorders. He's also the director of Camp Kesem, which is a national organization offering one-week camp opportunities for children whose families have been affected by cancer. We all know him also as a professional speaker and educator. Scott's delivered many keynotes and educational sessions at dozens of conferences, training events, and camps. Each summer, Scott travels the country sharing his skills with hundreds of camps and thousands of staff and administrators, both in the United States and Canada. I hope you've all had an opportunity to see Scott's video. We squashed it on conflict resolution. If you have any questions, please type them into the questions tab on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and Scott will do his best to answer them over the duration of this webinar. Scott's one of the original faculty members of Expert Online Training, and he's been around with us as we've grown the business and grown the visibility of online education in the camp space. And I'm excited to introduce my buddy, Scott Arizona.
Thanks, Evan. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I'm really excited about the next hour we have together to talk about conflict resolution and problem solving. And like Evan said, I'm hoping that you've had a chance to watch the We Squashed It video. If not, you know, I would love for you to take the opportunity after this hour to check it out. To sort of kick it off, I want to first of all say, you know, please send whatever questions that you have. We'll try to keep on this sort of topic of conflict resolution, problem solving, sort of behavior management pieces. But please send the questions through. We'd love to hear from you. We do have a number of questions that sort of came through before the webinar started, and those are some of the things that we'll try and discuss as we're going. Before we get started, though, I wanted to talk a little bit, take 5 minutes to talk a little bit about some of the pieces that we sort of don't cover in the video. Some of the stuff that I think is really important for us to be able to talk with our staff about, for us to understand as directors, program directors, leaders at camp, as far as what is conflict management, what is problem solving, you know, what does behavior management really even mean? And I sort of wanted to start there. Essentially, you know, a lot of this the conflict management pieces, you know, it's about helping kids develop resources. It's about helping kids develop a tool belt. You know, the reality is that we aren't there a lot of times when kids are having issues, dealing with conflict, are trying to sort out problems in their real everyday lives, whether that's the 1 or 2 or 4 weeks that they're with us at camp, or the rest of the year. And, you know, I think part of the idea behind conflict management and problem solving is that we're, you know, youth development professionals. So what does that mean? We're not just concerned with the 1 or 2 or 4 weeks that they spend with us. We're concerned with making sure that they have the skills and resources necessary to be successful in all the other stuff that they're doing. So with that, you know, part of my idea behind conflict management and problem solving is that, you know, sort of the active role, the active participant, the active player in conflict management is really them. You know, we're not the sort of disciplinarian. We're not the active member. We're there as an adult to help guide them through the process. So, you know, I know that that may sound familiar, but I think it's something that we have to really take on and believe in order for us to do the right thing by kids and helping them develop it. So what does that actually mean on the ground? What's the practical piece? Is that it's not going to sound like you want it to sound. It's not going to go down the way you want it to go down. When you're asking kids about, you know, what are some of the different choices they can make, or why are they having this issue with this particular kid, or so on and so forth, it doesn't sound like we want it to sound. They're not going to sit up and go, well, you know, I think, you know, I need to, you know, go over and shake his hand and say I'm sorry and explain why, you know, I was so mad and so on and so forth. It never sounds like that with kids. And so I want to sort of start by talking about that and start by saying, look, you know, the reality is that, you know, the work that we're doing with kids is to help them develop these skills. not for just us to get through the moment, which I know and I respect that a lot of times that's how staff feel. It's like, look, I'm just trying to get to lunch, man. And I get that. And I think, though, we have an opportunity at camp, unlike a lot of other adults and a lot of other spaces that we find ourselves with kids, where we can be really effective at teaching some of these skills. Another really big idea that I often talk about that I want us to spend some time on is a concept called selective negative focus, or it's this idea that oftentimes when it comes to kids and their behavior, particularly around conflict, we actually only see the problem stuff. It's selective negative focus as far as the behavior that we're seeing. And I think what we need to learn how to do as an adult population working with kids is really to see the positive stuff, the good choices that they're making as exactly that, choices that they're making. I think it's part and parcel of the same idea. Kids sort of most of the time are doing the right thing. They're getting along. They're being respectful. They're sharing. They're, doing all these great things. And then there's a problem. There's a conflict between two kids within a group, so on and so forth. And it's almost like we just open our eyes at that moment and see this behavior. And I really think we need to work at seeing all behavior as what it is actual choices. Another really big idea that is I'm sure will come up in some questions that I think the video does a really great job of highlighting is that our emotions and how we feel about a particular behavior that we're seeing often doesn't really help the camper or the kid learn. And what I mean by that is not that we don't have feelings about the behavior that we're seeing, not that it's not frustrating or disappointing, or on the positive side of behavior, not that we're not really proud and really sort of elated sometimes at seeing some of the behavior that we see. It's that the expression of those emotions don't always help kids learn. Meaning, a lot of times staff will resort to raising their voice, slamming doors, getting sort of the expression is that I'm really pissed off at what's going on. That doesn't, not only does it not help them learn, it doesn't help sort of role model the appropriate ways to handle some negative emotions and so on and so forth. So really talking about to our staff about how our emotions and the expression of those things don't help kids learn, and what are better ways for us not only to role model those, but to express those in the moment. Understanding that having issues and pushing up against boundaries and sort of being in conflict, a lot of times this is how kids learn what to do. This is how kids learn how to behave. And I think we have to understand that in order to go into a process of helping kids sort of deal with some of the conflicts. And really the last two pieces that I wanted to talk about before we get into some of the questions that you guys have submitted is understanding sort of our role and that we're not in control. And it's a hard thing, I think, for a lot of adults to understand, and it's certainly really hard for us to let go of. But the reality is that we don't make these choices for kids. We wish we could, of course, but we don't. We're just, when you're with a bunch of kids, you're not in control. Like the choices that these 8, 9-year-olds are making isn't, your responsibility. So what is your responsibility then? In my opinion, when it comes to conflict management or problem solving or any kind of behavior management, your job as the adult and the job that your staff members have as the adults and sort of in that space is to create all the boundaries and limitations around whatever's going on. So, whether it's we're at a particular activity, we're moving from point A to point B, we're living together in this cabin, we're existing at day camps in this group together, whatever the situation is, my job as the adults is to sort of create the boundaries and limitations around what their behavior or what's okay from them and what's not okay. And then when those boundaries get crossed or pushed, to be there to say, hey, when this happens, this is the consequence. You may not like the consequence, you may not agree with the consequence, and this is the consequence. It sort of changes a bit of who we are when it comes to this sort of role within conflict management problem solving. And then the last piece is really, we talk a lot about in the video that when kids are having issues, when kids are in conflict, a lot of times it's evidence of a skills deficit. That they don't know exactly how to do some of these things. And we pinpoint, I think, 6 different areas where kids have some skills deficit. Decision-making, hypothetical thinking or what if, self-expression, keeping your cool, so on and so forth. Those are all in there. I think it's helpful to think about those as a coping strategy. They don't have the skills to get through this particular moment. So what they're doing, the behavior that they're showing, is their way of sort of coping with whatever it is that's happening. I think when we can start thinking about it like that, we start understanding that, this particular action, this particular behavior makes sense to them. It might not be healthy or appropriate or okay, but it makes sense to them. And I think that's just an important sort of piece to grasp. A question just came through that I'd love to answer. It says, how do you think this topic is best presented and taught in staff training? Role plays, videos, handouts? This is going to be an interesting answer. I think yes to all of everything. I don't think we can talk about sort of behavior management or conflict enough. I think it's a question that I get from not only directors when I go to camps, but every staff member wants to have more tools when it comes to problem solving and conflict management and behavior stuff. So to, I guess, more specifically answer your question, I would say that conflict management or problem solving should be one of your 2, 3, 4 kind of themes of training, and you should sort of come back to it time and time again. The particular maybe session that you go over some of the skills involved in having conversations with kids or sort of talking to kids about what appropriate consequences would be if they've done X, Y, or Z behavior. I think that's the sort of foundation that you then go back to. So you can link in role plays that you're doing to have a sort of a conflict piece that you can, role play out in front of everybody. Certainly videos, check out the expert online training videos and play them in front of your whole staff. Don't just have it be the thing that they watch before summertime. Play it for them at the actual, when you're actually at camp. And, pause it halfway through and say, okay, well, what would you do in this situation? Or how does this look like camp? Or how does it not look like our camp? But really spend time watching these videos and breaking them down. Handouts, any kind of other sort of complementary pieces that you can put in your staff manual, that's all, it's great. It's great information, but I think every single one of us recognizes that our staff isn't necessarily going to sit down with their staff manual, their handbook, or a handout once a kid's gotten in a fight or a kid's dealing with a clique in their cabin or their group and say, okay, well, what was step 1? I think what the handouts really need to do is inform the conversation that you have, whether that's small group or large group, whether that's doing role plays with your staff or other particular activities. Ooh, this is an interesting question that just came through. What are the key differences to focus on in training with male versus female campers? My best suggestion when it comes to some of the differences between working with boys and girls is really to check out a lot of the stuff that is on Expert Online Training. That Dr. Michael Thompson has done some stuff around working with boys. And then another resource out there is Bob Ditter, who does a lot of stuff around gender. And I think both of those folks have some really great ideas on how to sort of break down some of the key differences. As far as I'm concerned and the advice that I can give, the reality is that when you take a look at something like We Squashed It or the handout that comes with it, or even some of the things that we're learning from Dr. Thompson, or Chris Thurber has also done a bunch of stuff on boys and working with boys. The principles are all kind of the same no matter who you're working with. It's the expression of those things that then sound different. And the reality is that you don't have to be a gender studies major. You don't have to be a counselor to be able to work through some of those things. My suggestion would be take some of those role plays, some of those same ideas, some of these key sort of bullet points in whether it's this or any other material that you have, and then break it down with your staff and have your young people talk to you or talk to each other, I should say, about the differences, about what does separating people when you're in cool down mode and there's just been a fight, what does that look like and sound like? How is that different when we're dealing with a fight that just happened in a boys' cabin versus a boys' cabin? When we're starting to talk about how do you make amends, or how do you deal with something that you've done and now there's sort of ramifications throughout your group, well, what does that look like and sound like? How is that different when we're talking with a bunch of, let's say, 13 or 14-year-old girls versus 8 or 9-year-old boys? I mean, I think that your staff will be able to sort of get into that more so maybe than just you presenting information. I'm more of a fan of it that way anyways, because oftentimes when you're presenting information, like saying, hey, some expert or some book tells us that we should handle it like this with girls or like this with boys, you know, a lot of times what people hear and what they sort of do is come up with all the reasons why that's not going to work. Well, in this situation, that wouldn't have worked, or in this situation, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, so let's not then do it in that situation if it's not going to work. If we can sort of turn it over to the rest of the staff and say, well, talk to us about what your experience has been, they're less likely, I think, to contradict some of that stuff and more likely to take some of that stuff on. Let me get into some of the questions that were posted earlier, and we'll kind of go through it like that. One question that came through was that when kids get into trouble, they never want to take responsibility. How do you help kids see that they were a part of the problem? This is like that classic moment, right? Every kid you sit down with and you start to talk to them about whatever happened, and immediately they're like, I didn't do it, I didn't know, it wasn't me, or they made me do it, whatever. You know, it's like that classic moment. No kid, of course, wants to take responsibility, and that's really throughout the process, right? When they first get in trouble, when you're starting to talk to them about sort of potential ideas or solutions to sort of get through the particular issue. You know, kids seek to sort of place blame kind of everywhere else. You know, an interesting technique and one that I find particularly effective is to really not argue with kids. When they say stuff like, well, I didn't do it. Okay, you know, like 9 times out of 10, I wasn't there anyways, or I didn't see everything anyways. So I'm not about to argue with you whether you're 8 or 10 or 12 or 14. And besides, you know, I'm an adult. Why would I sort of argue with a kid anyways? So when they kind of go there immediately, oh, I didn't do it. Oh, it's like, okay, well, you know, what happened? What did you do? How did you handle it? You know, when he or she did this, or when that group, you know, did that to you, or made you do the thing, whatever it was, well, what did you do? How did you, you know, what did you say? How did it feel? Asking those kinds of questions, I think, helps to sort of circle back around to them, which is essentially what they're seeking to do. They're seeking to sort of take, you know, the focus off of them onto other people, you know, sort of, again, kind of push the responsibility out. And I think that's a really powerful way to sort of insist that, you know, we're all, if it's a social situation, we're sort of all part of the issue, all part of the problem, and to sort of bring this person right back in to the sort of center of it by just using the questions that you ask. Of course, we've all dealt with those kids, and you've been with those kids who sort of to the very end will not take responsibility. And I often think that, you know, when you're in that space with a kid who absolutely is adamant, I didn't do it, you know, I wasn't part of it, so on and so forth, it's just like, all right, you know what, maybe that kid isn't really ready to have this conversation right now, and maybe we need to take a step back, give them another couple of minutes to cool down. Maybe it's me. Maybe, you know, I'm the one that is always having to talk to you about this stuff. Maybe if I invite my co-counselor into it and they have this conversation with you, maybe it'll be different. Maybe if I get my unit leader involved. You know, there's lots of different ways to sort of try to engage that kid. You know, the last piece I want to speak to when it comes to this responsibility piece, and then another question just came in that I would love to talk about. But the final piece is, when kids are seeking to sort of not take responsibility, it provides us an opportunity to engage sort of, what's happening on the staff level. A lot of the times, we as staff members, and certainly every camp director out there has had the frustration of saying to your staff, please ask for help, please invite people in, and then gets really frustrated because rarely, if ever, do staff do it. I think this provides a really great opportunity when we are working with kids to try and find some solutions to help them see what behaviors, might sort of will get them closer to sort of what they want or what they need. Sometimes we're just not the effective person, and I think that when we can keep it focused on that particular kid and say, you know what, it's not about me, it's about this kid, that's when inviting other people in and asking for help really becomes a really practical strength because I'm keeping it focused on this kid, and you know what, I'm just not getting anywhere right now. So to invite another person in. Let me see. The question is, how does this apply to our counselors? How can we squash drama or conflict amongst our staff? What's interesting about that question is my opinion is that it doesn't really change at all when it comes to your counselors and your staff. The example that I often use when I'm talking about this is it's sort of like going from a frontline staff member to a member of the leadership team who's not necessarily with kids anymore. A lot of times that transition happens with little to no training. And what I always like to say to that group of people is that, the same skills that allowed you to be really successful with a group of 10-year-olds or a group of 14-year-olds is the exact same skill set that's going to allow you to be successful with, 40 adults. Just the expression is different. How it sounds is different. The way you are actively engaged in listening, or the way that you help them work through some of their problems, it sounds different, but the principle isn't the same. The principle is totally the same. So how does this apply to our counselors? I mean, if you are having sort of really high conflict, sort of highly dramatic situations happening, well, the same sort of steps apply, right? You've got to get people in an emotionally cool space, right? You've got to get people to calm down first and foremost. No one, whether they're an adult or kid, is going to work through productively or effectively work through a problem when their emotions are running high, when they're feeling really upset and they feel slighted, or they feel like someone's talking behind their back, or they feel sort of put down or whatever. No one's going to be able to work through their issues. So we got to give them some space. We got to get them to cool down. A lot of us during staff training talk about, hey, if you need a minute, you need a break, that's when you can come and find me. I have an open door policy, all this kind of stuff. This is when that's really helpful, when you can go in and relieve them, give them a 10-minute break and take their group. This is when that open door policy is really important, because a lot of times people need to come into your office and shut the door and just straight up vent to you and yell and scream for a minute about how unfair something is, or about how they're feeling slighted maybe by a coworker or a colleague. And those are important times, and that's when it's important for you to provide that. And then once they're cooled down, once they can have some perspective around what's going on, I think we back up a little bit and have a conversation with them about, okay, what's important, and sort of reframing or refocusing ourselves on the kids and their experience is something that we always need to come back to. But then what does that conversation then really sound like? And I think the answer to that is, all right, well, what is the issue? Like, let's talk about it. And for you as the leader, the director, I almost said adult in this situation, but for you as that person who's helping your staff members sort of through this, creating that constant framework, but then asking questions just like we would with kids around what the problem is, and going through it over and over and asking it in different ways and helping them draw that kind of problem out which will then hopefully lead you to, okay, these are the problems, these are the specific things that you were responsible for within this problem. What's now some things that you can do about it? What can you do about it? Not what can the other person, the other group of people, your coworker at arts and crafts, whatever it is, not what can they do about it, but what can you do about it? And engaging on that level of where is the control? And then, of course, going to sort of try or test one of those possible solutions out. And if you're sort of really listening or sort of paying attention to what I just said, I just walked through a regular sort of set of classic kind of problem-solving steps. And that's really, what I would say about working through it with staff. I mean, you've got to not avoid it, you've got to talk about it, and you've got to ask enough questions that you can really draw out the problem. So those are some of the ideas that I would suggest as far as dealing with a lot of the drama that happens within your staff. Next question here: how do you deal with youth who are constantly causing some sort of conflict or disruption in a cliquish manner? And secondly, how do you work with parents of those youth that can't quite get a handle on the situation either? That is a big question, and that's probably its own webinar, but let's try and tackle some of it briefly. How do you deal with youth that are constantly causing some sort of conflict or disruption? Yeah, these kids are definitely hard to work with. And I think one of the big principles that you have to go back to, which is sort of the stuff that I kind of talked about right at the beginning, is getting staff to really understand that, this is really how they learn. And for you to go back to the same conversation with the same kid about the same behavior over and over and over again is important for them to learn. They're learning about clarity and consistency right now, that if it's not okay on day one, it's not going to be okay on day two, on day three, and so on. That if it's not okay if you're around, it's still not okay if the other counselors are around, or if no counselor is around. And for you to deal with it in the sort of same way, methodically, without sort of more or less emotion, back to some of the big ideas that we were talking about, shows kids that, will give kids this understanding that the boundary or limitation is real. So that's the sort of first thing, is we need to help staff understand all those principles. We also need to help staff understand that they may be the only adult in this kid's life that is willing to continue to have this same conversation over and over and over again. That we at camp and as youth development professionals, I think, frankly, are the only ones that are going to take the time to have this conversation. It's that important that we continue to have this conversation over and over and over again. Of course, each and every one of you at your camps and your facility already have sort of a discipline strategy that lays out, steps and how consequences get elevated and all that kind of stuff. I think that's important. I think you need to continue to have those things. And even if it's a generally mild behavior, if you have some sort of policy around how discipline and consequences get elevated, you need to stick to that. Kids learn that our policies, our consequences aren't real if I can just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again and nothing really ever changes. All that ever happens is that, I have to sit out for 5 minutes or whatever. So stick to your policy. Teach our staff, why it's so important to sort of keep going back to that same, having that same conversation in those same moments. And then, causing, the question was, how do you deal with a youth that's sort of constantly causing some sort of conflict or disruption? I think that's when we really have to take a look at what are our consequences. A lot of times, and a question that actually came through, I'll try and find it, a lot of times our consequences fall into the category of punishment and aren't necessarily sort of logical consequences. And what I mean by that is, a great example is, okay, I'm going to take away dessert after dinner tonight, or the special, free swim that we were going to do tomorrow, because I know you really want to do that. And so you're screwing around today at arts and crafts, or doing this sort of consistent disruption piece, so I'm going to take away this other thing. It can be effective because it sometimes has the ability to stop this behavior sort of in the moment. But my issue with that is that it doesn't really teach kids about control. It doesn't really teach kids about where the control is. The control is sort of outwardly. Not to mention, you just gave them sort of a free pass on screwing around between now and when the good thing was supposed to happen anyways, because they're like, well, it already got taken away. So the more logical consequence is to come away from the activity, not be able to be involved with the group, and then really, have to have this initial conversation. And a lot of people push back on me and say, well, Scott, yeah, but what happens then with that kid who is just always going to screw around because they don't want to be a part of the activity. They don't like the activity. My question to you right back is, well, what's wrong with your activity? The reality is that you and your staff should be working hard at making what you're doing at camp interesting and engaging. Kids should want to be participating in it. I'm not talking about the handful of kids that, have their moments, or everybody has a bad day, so on and so forth. But, the reality is that sort of the entire experience, specifically of camp, is about fun, is about recreation. We should be able to sort of work towards engaging every kid on that kind of level. So those are some of the things that I would work through to deal with that kid who's sort of constantly, disruptive or in conflict. How do we deal with those parents that aren't, sort of seeing the big picture? One piece with parents that I think I didn't really understand until I was a parent is that a lot of kids, a lot of parents who have kids that maybe have a diagnosis or are constantly in trouble or so on, or a lot of different things, are sometimes their kid's only advocate. So hearing from you, just sort of another adult telling them that their kid has been screwing up, they get into sort of quickly into sort of defense mode. And I think one of the things that we can do in those situations is to really help parents understand there are a lot of things that your kid is doing well. And then start by having that conversation. And I'm not talking about some sort of disingenuous praise sandwich or whatever. I'm talking about really, sort of being real with parents and saying, hey, there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's really great, and just talking to parents about that, and helping them understand that our whole job and our whole mode of operating is about seeing your kid be successful and having fun. And these behaviors that we're seeing are stifling that success and stifling that fun. How can we sort of broaden the conversation to that point with parents? Looks like we've got a couple more questions. I'm going to move on. And what consequences do you suggest after a timeout? That's an interesting question, because I personally don't believe there's an answer to that question, because I don't know what the situation is and I don't know who the kids are. I know it seems like a cop-out answer, but that's the 100% truth, right? A wonderful example of this is when kids are homesick. Almost everybody at Camp Day, or resident, by the way, has dealt with a kid who's just extremely homesick. And one of the go-to solutions is to create this sort of connection with home, right? Write a letter home, make something at Arts and Crafts for home, whatever, just talk about home, so on, so on and so forth. So you all have experienced that, right? Where with kid A, it's like magic, man. I mean, you start writing a letter home, next thing you know, they start feeling better. It doesn't even matter what they've written, and they can sort of move on and sort of get through it. Whereas kid B, you start talking about home, and he totally falls apart. He's like crying even harder into his spaghetti. I think the same thing is true with consequences for any kind of behavior problem. The number one strategy to working through effective logical consequences is going to be to have a relationship with the actual individual kid, to understand who they are and what's motivating to them and why they're making some of the choices that they're making, and how does that fit into sort of the greater framework around their group and this sort of this idea of kind of social centrality, where how they're sort of connected to everybody else. I mean, fact of the matter is a timeout, removal from activity, is really just kind of step one when kids are screwing around or misbehaving or being disruptive. What happens in step 2, 3, and 4, whether it's removal from the primary group and placed into a secondary group, talking to somebody with quote unquote more authority, like getting, for example, a unit leader or a director involved, contacting parents, letting them know what's going on, doing some sort of behavior contract. A technique that I love, a consequence, quote unquote consequence that I absolutely love, is talking to the kid when they're not in trouble. I mean, kids that get in trouble a lot, when they are feeling really successful, when they're having a great day, when they're having a lot of fun, and you bring it up with them and say, yesterday when we were having that issue, what else could I have done to sort of help you through that? Kids have some wonderful clarity. So, I know that that's not really answering the question as far as what's the actual consequence, but again, I don't really know the answer to that question, and I'm not sure there is a good answer. There's lots of different things we could do, but my point is like, where is this particular kid? How can we meet them where they're at? And what is a consequence that's going to help them develop more control around their behavior? All right, let's see here. Next question. If we accept that we have some constraints in our camp, meaning certain expectations for revenue, numbers of campers, budget, numbers of staff, so on, etc., it often feels like we don't have the time to address conflict in a truly productive or developmental way. That is, watching the video makes me envious of the staff member having lots of time to take a child aside and having a great conversation. I got to scroll down a little bit. What suggestions do you have for balancing the need to spend that time for it to be beneficial, needing to stick with the curriculum or activity schedule? I totally get that, and I respect that that's a real, practical, everyday issue when it comes to the camps that we're running, the programs that we're running. We have a responsibility to parents and other stakeholders to say, hey, this is the program, this is what kids are going to experience. I'm basically going to say something that now contradicts exactly what I just said, because I feel like it is our responsibility to take that extra time. Like I sort of said before, we may be the only adults that ever do take this kind of time. And to have an extra 5-minute conversation with a camper who's having some sort of issue is our responsibility. We have to constantly balance these two things. And sometimes that means the conversation doesn't look like it looked on the video. Sometimes it means the conversation is happening while we're walking to the next thing or getting involved in the next activity. Sometimes that's actually what kids need, is to say, okay, there was a big fight that just happened. Everyone needs to cool down. Right now it's time for us to transition into going to arts and crafts, so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk with this one kid, he's going to walk with the other kid, the whole group is going to go to arts and crafts, and when we get there, we're going to take a minute to cool out, and we're going to continue the conversation. Sometimes that means that the conversation happens over the course of a couple of hours, and we have to come back to it because we're having to respect and balance that time. Sometimes it means that kids aren't going to get the full experience that we call camp, right? The full activity or curriculum schedule, because it's important enough for us to talk about what it means when kids are bullying each other, or what it means to a kid's experience when we've created a clique in our group. I think it's that important, and I would be willing at the camps that I run to look a parent straight in the eye and say, you know what, your kid didn't get to go in the pool or to make a tie-dye shirt because we had to have this conversation. It was really important, and it was important that he or she understood the consequence to this particular thing. There's not an easy way to balance this, but in my opinion, Those are the important things that we're teaching young people. How to control ourselves, how to respect each other, how to be responsible for each other. That, in my opinion, is way more important than, did my kid get to go swimming today? Did my kid get to make a tie-dye shirt today? Next question. If negative behavior continues, should they then go to the director? Yeah, my first opinion about that would be to go back to what your discipline sort of strategy or policy says. How does something get elevated from kind of an annoying behavior that a counselor is dealing with sort of time and time again, to removal from an activity, to having to talk to maybe some sort of like unit leader or other sort of higher authority, to going to the director, to having to talk to parents, to not being able to be at camp anymore? How does it get elevated? And I think that's a question that each organization has to answer a little bit differently. But certainly, I mean, the easy answer to that question, if a negative behavior continues, should they go to a director? Sure. Yeah, I mean, they should. I mean, if a negative behavior continues and the kinds of things that a staff member is doing or the kind of consequences that a staff member is delivering because of this negative behavior, if they're ineffective, well, of course, we need to elevate it. Almost like the question that was just asked before about how do you balance time. Another thing is that I know very few camps where there's a one-on-one ratio, where I can just sit down with you because you're my one camper, and I can spend all the time in the world talking to you about this. And most camps operate on a 1:5, 1:8, 1:20 ratio, where every minute that I'm spending talking to you about your particular behavior is a minute I'm not spending with everybody else. So there's that piece too, where it's like, look, if a negative behavior is just continuing, going on and on and on, well, of course, you need to get other people involved and ask for some help. There was a question that came in before this started that I would love to talk about. In the video, I reference sort of some collaborative problem-solving techniques around asking some interesting questions when you're involved in this conversation with kids or with adults or with staff for that matter about, what do you want or what do you need? It's a really interesting set of questions because we're not often asking these questions to kids, which I think is important. And also, I think it's pinpointing sort of an essential function of behavior and choices, which is I'm trying to get what I want, or what I need. And when I don't get those things, I get frustrated or I feel slighted, I'm disappointed, and so I act out. And that acting out is working, again, to getting me the things that I want. Look, I have a 3-year-old in my house, right? My daughter is 3 years old. Her name is Linnea. And I ask these two questions all the time. And they're questions that I have to ask sort of point blank like that. Like, Linnea, what do you want right now when you're laying on the floor screaming, or whining? It's like, oh, you wanna, you wanted to do more of this other game. Okay, all you have to do is say that out loud. And I'm constantly in this teaching mode. The question that came earlier was, what if you ask these questions, and I won't use the word because it's some profanity, but and they tell you to go away from them is maybe the more sensitive way to say this. Again, there was some profanity in this question. So, well, of course, if a kid is telling you, in no uncertain terms to sort of get away from them, one of the things is that they're obviously going through is that they're not sort of ready to work through the issue yet, or even have that conversation. They need some more space. They need some more time. They need to sort of cool down. So you want to give them some space. You want to, maybe ask them to walk with you a little bit. Maybe you want to have them sort of stick with you until we get to the next activity, or maybe at the next activity, maybe you can sort of start the activity with them and kind of engage them on that level. If a kid is swearing at you, or if a kid is, really that sort of hot that they're not really ready to have a conversation with you, a great technique is just to give, a full minute or two of silence. A lot of us are not afraid, but a lot of us have a hard time with silence. Giving kids that moment and that space is incredibly important. So I think giving them that, I think, will be really helpful. There's a couple other questions that I would love to sort of hit momentarily here. One of them was, how do you get kids to do the right thing? And do was sort of emphasized. Make a better choice, and really just not just say the right thing. I think one of the things that this question is alluding to is that a lot of kids have been in these kinds of adult conversations so many times that they kind of know the right thing to say. I had a kid a couple years ago sort of sit down with me and just really go through it front to back. I mean, he was like, look, Scott, I got in trouble, I did this thing, I was really mad, and it's okay for me to be mad, but I shouldn't hit my friends. And just like walked right through it in 3 minutes, told me basically everything that I would have said to him or sort of walked through with him. The issue for him was he could say the right thing, but it was doing the behavior, making the better choice in the moment, right? So where I was working with him and the kind of suggestions and solutions that I had was not what's the better choice to make, but more like how are we going to sort of help you sort of stop and think and really make the better choice. It was sort of this, it was a behavioral piece versus sort of the intellectual or understanding it. So how do you get kids to actually do the right thing? Consistency, in my opinion. Consistency. That, with that particular kid, what I did is I sat down with the counselors, and every time this kid did something that was a more negative choice, we went through this exact same process. What we tried to do with the staff members is we tried to come up with some indicators that this particular kid was going to go off, sort of going to go off the charts, so to speak. So when they started seeing some of those things happen, they pulled the kid aside before he freaked out and started to have some of those conversations. But it was every time. It was consistent. Every time they saw something like that happen, this is how we are going to respond. That helped, I think, the kids sort of learn a more consistent approach to how he was going to handle some of his not so great choices. Some of the other questions that I really, this was a great question that came in earlier that I really wanted to talk about. So what are the best ways to help kids develop better behavior and see the good behavior? And see was in quotes. And so I think this question probably came from somebody who heard me talk before about this idea of selective negative focus and not really seeing a lot of behavior as exactly what it is, a lot of the positive stuff as actual behavior. I think the best way to help teach staff how to see this behavior is to be very specific about what it is that we're looking for, what it is that we want to see. So much so that you actually want to train your staff, and yourselves for that matter, to be in situations and say to yourself, I mean almost out loud, what am I looking for right now? What do I want to see happen? And I think when we can start to do that, we start to see behaviors in sort of a different light. I do this all the time with my actual staff. What am I looking for? What do I want to have happen? When I see my staff with a group of kids, what do I want to see them doing? I want to see them being really engaged. I want to see somebody pick up on that one kid isn't feeling sort of as positive about this particular activity as maybe another kid, and he's starting to withdraw a little bit. I want to see my staff notice when the group is sort of starting to fall apart at the edges, right? When it's like starting to fray, when maybe the activity is going just a little too long, right? When I can ask myself that question and I can be conscious about that stuff, guess what I'm actually noticing? Not only when it doesn't happen. We all do that. Directors do that with their staff. Staff do that with their kids. We see when people are screwing up, not doing the right thing. But I also start noticing when that one particular counselor saw that kid who was starting to withdraw, or that one particular counselor noticed the whole group needed sort of a shift in the sort of energy, the momentum of whatever was going on in this activity, and started to sort of drive the group in that direction. When I start to see those things, guess what now I can do with that? I can notice it out loud, I can acknowledge it, I can pull that staff member over and say, whoa, that was really sort of intuitive of you to see that the group was falling apart. I really love that. What I just did is praise, right? Now, it doesn't sound like the same way I'd praise a 10-year-old and say, awesome, dude, way to go. When you were out there and, you were kicking the ball to each other, that was, or passing the ball, that was really great teamwork. I mean, of course I wouldn't sound the same when I'm talking to a 10-year-old, but certainly it's the same principle. So how do we help staff sort of see the better behavior? It's by actually asking that stuff out loud and being conscious that you're keeping those behaviors on the forefront. Another question that came in earlier, we already responded to something like that. That was about conflict between staff. It says, what should I do if I'm really upset or disturbed by a behavior? I think this goes back to our emotions, right? I mean, it's fair for you to be really upset and disturbed by behavior. In fact, all of us have been in a situation where we feel like, man, this kid was like put on the planet to piss me off. We've all had, those kids in our groups, and I think the reality is it's okay to be emotionally honest with the kids. It's okay to say stuff like, look, I'm really upset. I'm feeling frustrated right now because I've asked you guys to do X, Y, or Z, or because we've had this conversation before, right? What's not okay is to express those sort of negative feelings in a way that that is scary, that is out of control, that role models basically the wrong way for kids to handle those emotions. So what should you do? I think it's a perfect opportunity to ask for help. It's a perfect opportunity to invite somebody else into the conversation. It's a perfect opportunity to switch out with your coworker. It's a perfect opportunity to show this kid, hey, you know what? We both need to step back for a minute and have a moment to sort of relax, to take a deep breath, and re-engage in this conversation. And at the end of the day, if the human resources aren't in place, you don't have another coworker that you can invite into it, if the camp director or the unit leader is busy with some other thing, this is a great opportunity for you to remember, you know what? There are kids. They're 12 or they're 8 or they're 16, however old they are, and you're an adult. If you are really upset and disturbed by their behavior, you need to remember that arguing with them isn't going to help. That you need to take a step back, get that bigger perspective, and understand this whole situation is about them learning some better behavior versus you sort of imposing in on, sort of what your big ideas are. All right, I wanted to cover one last question. We've got about 5 more minutes, and I wanted to cover one last question because I think it's something that's on a lot of our radars. And the question was very simple. It says, how do these ideas work when it comes to bullying? And my particular opinion is in the exact same way. Bullying is exactly like any other negative behavior that we're seeing. It's evidence of some sort of skills deficit. They're not getting what they want. They're not being able to connect in socially in a specific way. And it's just their coping mechanism. Now, what's interesting about bullying, and it's something that I'm not sure we've really been talking a lot about, is that it's actually a pretty effective strategy if you think about it, right? I mean, bullies sort of get what they want by bullying. That's why they go back to it time and time again. I'm not saying it's healthy or it's okay or we should allow it to happen. I'm just saying that it's pretty effective, and so we need to recognize it as this skills deficit. If they are trying to connect and they're bullying kids, and that's what's created this sort of high conflict situation in a group, then what we need to do is really think about, well, what is the skill that they're sort of lacking? Do they know how to engage kids on a different kind of level? Do they know how to relate to kids on a different kind of level? Do they know how to create a meaningful relationship where kids respect them, are responsible for them, care about them in a different kind of way? And I think Those are some of the questions. But if you really break down what we talked about in the We Squashed It video, whether it's cooling down, having a conversation, classic problem-solving skills, those are the same things, I believe, that we're going to use in a teasing or bullying situation, whether we're talking to the bully about some of their behavior, whether we're talking to the victim about choices that they can make in that situation, or whether we're talking to everybody else, the bystanders, about the power that they have in a situation where people are bullying. It's the same essential skills. So with that, I can see on my clock here we're just about out of time. I want to say thank you to all of you who have tuned in for this hour. It's a lot of fun. As you can see from what we've talked about, there's, I think, a lot of different directions to go with all this stuff, and I hope that we can all keep having the conversation. And as we turn the corner here into the summer and we're starting to get ready to train staff and really think about this, I want to go back to the very first question that was asked, which is, what are the best ways to train everybody on this? And I think, again, it's all of the above. It's continuing to have this conversation, and it's continuing to pay attention to what's happening between kids, between staff, between adults and kids, and everything else at camp. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and I hope this was helpful.